let's go into it.
Walters945, and I guess Casanova here. What are you doing? Casanova the coding cat.
Nice code.
Salesforce development can be complex, but it does not need to be confusing. There's so many
That's true.
different things that you can learn, so it's hard to pick actually what you need to learn, especially when you are first starting out. That's why I've created a Salesforce developer roadmap for those beginning developers to kind of follow along and understand the more important things that they should be looking at. Hey everybody, Walters954 here. I've been doing Salesforce development for a pretty long time now.
So first, looks really great because I don't know what tool is it, but the tool itself looks really great.
And I'm starting to impart my knowledge onto you new developers and those that want to start learning development even more. In this video, I'm going to focus on this developer roadmap that I have created, which will help walk you through some of the different areas that you should be looking at so you can focus on the most important things and stop getting lost in all of the things that are available on the great platform of Salesforce. You can grab this PDF guide completely free over at salesforcementor.com. And there's even an expanded version that you can go through, which has even more detail on all of the different areas you should be looking into. And in the expanded version, there are links to different resources related to each of the different sections.
We'll definitely do
So,
that.
of course, we're going to start in programming fundamentals. These are the building blocks that you need to write code in any language. And of course, all of these are super important, right? You need to be able to write variables, flow control. So these are your if statements and other kind of logic statements, your collections. How do you use those, even though they're very similar to your variables and your data types, but how do you work with arrays and different sets of data? How do you collect them all together and then manipulate those values? You, of course, have loops. So these are things like your traditional for loops, and there are enhanced for loops and list for loops. And even deeper inside that, you'll have your break statements, continues. So lots of very interesting things inside of looping, and looping is super critical for just building efficient code.
And maybe something to add to this, that the problem with learning those topics is that they are so highly bound together. Like, you try to learn loops, and turns out you can't learn loops without learning lists. And you can't learn lists unless you learn SQL queries. Like, those all topics, they kind of wire together, and you kind of have to go through some topics without having the full picture. And this is the challenge that I see people when learn those topics.
There are also classes, objects, and functions. Now, this could potentially have been lumped into the object-oriented programming section, but I think just learning them in general, right, some of the general structures of how you create like functions and use classes and things like that is super important, because as soon as you start talking about object-oriented programming, you go more into some of these aspects here, like constructors, inheritance, and polymorphism. Now, these are critically important, especially when it comes to the Salesforce ecosystem, but it's okay when you're first starting out to just get a general understanding of these, and of course diving into a lot of these concepts later on as you're learning more in the Salesforce ecosystem.
Now, and I want to add to this, like, the amount of trouble that people have with understanding classes, objects, and functions or methods, you can call them that way, it just insane. Like, this is, if you take of all of this, the classes and objects are the hardest topics from what I see in my students. For some reason, there's this concept of having a class and then having objects doesn't really exist in the real world, right? And you try to make an analogy with, for example, custom objects and records, right? So custom objects, that would be classes, and records, that would be objects in Salesforce. But still there's so much more in Apex than that. So people have really hard times understanding those topics. And I totally agree with Walter. You don't have to go into the very deep stuff with the inheritance, for example. Like, inheritance, the times that I used inheritance in my developer career in Salesforce is so few times. I don't know, I've used it maybe a few times, but in general, you need to understand it though. You need to understand it, but you don't chances are in the next 2-3 years, as you starting out, you're not gonna use inheritance at all for Salesforce development. Versus loops, you're gonna be using all the time.
Now, I love this entire section because you can learn all of these things and then apply to so many different languages. You don't even have to learn these in Apex. I almost recommend learning in Java, which is a language very similar to Apex. Like Apex is a flavor of Java, basically. So you learn all of these in using.
Not anymore. Not anymore, because as soon as I will put out my platform, you can go and learn those things on the platform. You will learn it immediately in Apex, and you're not gonna need to switch into from Java to Apex. You can just learn it in Apex. That's the whole idea behind my startup.
Using whatever resources you're comfortable with, and then you can translate it over into Salesforce development. In terms of those resources, I recommend CS50, which is a Harvard computer science class, Code Academy, where you can get hands-on with many different languages, but I really like the Java course, and of course, Cloud Code Academy. This is my program where we teach you Salesforce development, and all of these fundamentals are included. Next.
Cloud Code Academy, really good. Um, what was that? What was that before? The CS50. Yeah, CS50. I don't like CS50. I know it's a standard to recommend. I know it's people recommend it a lot, and I know that a lot of people love it, and some of my students love it. For some reason, I don't find it useful actually. Like they CS50 goes through a lot of stuff and nothing really in depth. I don't find it that it's teaching you something. It's good as having an overview in general what's going on with computer science, but I don't know. I'm not such a big fan of CS50, but Code Academy is good, and of course, Walter's business is awesome.
Next, let's take a peek at tooling because all of this code is great, right? But where do we actually write it, especially as Salesforce developers? So on this side, we're talking more the tools that you need to write your code. And this really dives into the integrated development environment piece. So this is using Visual Studio Code to start writing your actual Salesforce code. Gone are the days of using the developer console. Just start out learning Visual Studio Code and using like the Salesforce extension pack, and of course learning those shortcuts inside of there. If you're just getting started out though, it's okay to use a developer console for like a few of those introductory and basic programming things, but it's really important to start getting hands-on with VS Code as your primary editor. And of course with that, Salesforce DX.
It's a bit of hassle to switch from developer console to VS Code, and actually it takes a little bit of, I would say, 1-2 weeks of adjustment to like get used to VS Code. But in general, if you know how to write code, that should be the same. And I agree with Walter. If you struggle with writing classes and objects and all of that, you probably shouldn't think about going into VS Code. You should rather go and try to do the developer console, and then so focus on the core concepts of programming. And once you have the core concepts of programming, you can also switch and add VS Code on top.
X kind of rolls into that. There are some advanced topics on here that you should just kind of read up on, especially like Scratch orgs. You're starting to dive deeper into Salesforce development versus just sticking in a general sense, which can be good in the beginning, but we want to be Salesforce developers, right? The Salesforce development roadmap, we've seen those crazy salaries that Salesforce developers can make. So this is why the roadmap is pushing us into that
In
Salesforce
US,
direction. Of
not in
course, we
Europe.
have things like version control, getting used to using Git and branching, right? All of these nodes are super important for managing your code. If it's not your code versions, you're potentially working with other people on teams and tracking that code base, and even your metadata that exists inside of Salesforce can be put into version control tools, which are super useful. One thing a little bit more advanced is like GitHub Action, doing some automation in your branches or in your repositories, and this kind of ties very closely into CI/CD, which can be super fun, but get very complex. And of course, I had to throw in the AI tools, and this is why this document is going to.
Before we go into AI, for those who want to learn this type of GitHub action, there's a free course, Sleep Salto. S what? Sleep Salto? Yeah, Sleep Salto. And if you click here on the all courses, there's this Salesforce CI/CD part 1 and part 2. Awesome. The best courses on the market that I could ever find. Very, very recommend it. I'm gonna send it by. I'm gonna include probably in the video. Let's go back. AI AI is good. I don't recommend though using ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot if you're just starting out. You could use ChatGPT though, so definitely not GitHub Copilot. Copilot takes you all the writing part, and when you're starting out, you definitely need to write a lot of stuff, right? So you need to develop these muscle memories. Even though if you're just hitting the keyboard, you still need to develop the muscle memories. And ChatGPT, good, but important, super important, not using it for solving tasks, using it for learning, for understanding, for asking questions and identifying what do you need to learn. Super important.
To continue to get updated yearly. We've seen an explosion over the last year with different AI tools that can be super helpful in learning and for coding in itself. I'm putting ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot on here, but especially for those beginner developers, I don't want you to focus very heavily on having these tools write all the code for you, especially ChatGPT. Use it to debug your code, right? Use it to ask questions and get answers on, okay, why am I getting this SOCL error? What's this logical error that I'm getting inside of my code? What's the best approach or some best practices that I should work with when I'm writing my code? ChatGPT can help point you in the right direction, but if you try to throw like your entire code base or whatever problem you're working on in there, it can easily spit out some answer that gives you a bunch of errors, and then it will steer you in the wrong direction. Similar setup with GitHub Copilot. I really only recommend you to use this once you're way past the fundamentals and you're starting to move deeper into getting the best practices down, because they can steer you wrong. So to reduce being steered in the wrong direction, I often recommend getting a mentor. I know in the past, Salesforce had mentorship platforms that you could go on and kind of sign up, but those have gone away. And recently I saw that there was a Trailblazer mentorship program that got launched. So I signed up there to be a mentor. And I think that's a great place for people to find experienced Salesforce development mentors. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. Moving into some more fun stuff, we have Apex Fundamentals. This is where we're going to start putting all of those programming building blocks to work. And now we have a little bit of tooling that we can marry it together so that we can actually write our code on the Salesforce platform. So in this, we're going to kind of not really relearn, but make sure that we understand the specifics of Apex in terms of its data types. This is figuring out the different data types that we want to use. And it's very important, right? When you're working with a currency field, what's the correct data type? When you're working with IDs of records, what's the correct data type? And there's actually an ID data type for that. So it's important to know the correct types of data types and working with S objects and how all of that.
I'm not sure. I wish I could modify this map, because like collections you can go a little bit, you can go more specific into collections like maps, sets and lists. And with the SOCL you have also like different SOCL. I don't know, maybe I wish I could modify it. Let's see what, get the roadmap here. Grab it for free. Oh my god, I don't want to sign up. I don't want to sign up. Okay, Google. Let's say Google. Hey, what does it mean? Okay, log in with Google. Okay. Not today. Not today.
Kind of plays into collections and using maps, and why are maps so important for Salesforce development. Then we jump into SOQL. We haven't really touched on querying yet, and it may need to be added into some of this programming fundamentals, which I'll just add it into here right now, right? We have SQL, which is a querying language, right? A very common one. And then we have the Salesforce object query language, so SOQL, and this is how we get data out of the Salesforce database and into our code so that we can do calculations, do manipulations on the sets of data, Database manipulation language, or DML, are the basic CRUD operations, right? Your create, read, update, and delete that we have inside of Salesforce. So now we're able to grab our data with SOQL and then manipulate our data, right? Insert new ones, update the values that are in there. And this is where the kind of magic starts to happen with all.
I think it's good. I'm not sure how much of a benefit though people are gonna have if they learn SQL, especially because SQL is quite different from SOQL. SOQL is quite intuitive. With SQL, you can go very very crazy. Like in my university, we used to do all the left join and blah 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 and all of this stuff. Like you can go really deep with SQL, and it's a little bit different. The structure is the same, the idea is kind of the same, but I think there's enough material to actually go and learn SOQL directly without needing to learn SQL. And in fact, I see a lot of people just doing that actually. So I've never had a single student who had troubles learning SOQL queries.
All of our code. With all of those changes, though, we have some limits that Salesforce puts in place so that we don't break things, right? These are the governor limits. And since Salesforce is a multi tenant environment, we have to make sure that our system, our code is not using up too many resources. This is where the governor limits come into play, and you need to be aware of the different ones that exist, especially the ones that are
That's
around
true.
SOQL and DML statements, right? This is where the best practices of like bulkification come into play, and we haven't talked about triggers yet. I guess it's up next. So your trigger best practices as well of having like one trigger per object. So we want to talk about magic. Let's take a look at Salesforce triggers. What triggers do are basically when events happen, your CRUD events or your DML events, when those go off, your Apex code can execute, often called like invoking your Apex code. But essentially, when you insert a record, let's say we insert a contact or a lead, you can create a trigger that will then fire some of your Apex code, execute some of your Apex code. Now, this code could be any business logic you like. Maybe it's counting values, maybe it's sending an integration, which we haven't talked about yet, sending an email, like all of these things. This is where your business logic starts coming alive when you're using triggers to execute a lot of your code. And
Yeah, I agree with Walter. I think triggers should be your first like real topic that you learn with the Salesforce development. Like you learn all of this stuff. Basically, you're kind of like building a bridge, right? So you wanna go from not knowing anything to go to the next side of writing some code, and you're building this like brick by brick with SOQL, with the DML operations, with the governor limits, and so on. God, I'm so triggered by this triggered. Yeah, this is triggers. This is what we have to live in Salesforce. So yeah, I agree totally. So that the triggers should be the first topic, and kind of maybe testing. Like sometimes I teach first testing, sometimes first triggers. I would say testing, even though it sounds like an easy topic, people have really hard time understand them.
and with all this code that we're writing, we need to then start working on test class.
SQL is full of triggers too. No wonder you went with the MongoDB. Those are similar triggers, I would say. Yeah, so yeah, those are similar triggers. Basically, the trigger in Salesforce is um, when something is inserted, any type of data manipulation happens, then you can run some kind of code. I guess the same. I'm not so sure about MongoDB though. Maybe it's the same in MongoDB. I heard that it's very similar, like very very frequent, just database concept.
Classes. Testing is super important because it makes you know that your code is actually working. It's writing code to make sure that your code is doing what you think your code is doing. And Salesforce is actually really interesting in this aspect. It's the only platform that has heard of it that does this, but it requires that you have 75% code coverage before you're able to deploy anything to production. So you can work in a sandbox all you want, but as soon as it's going to production, you need to have code coverage on there. There are some.
Well, requires. I've seen so many bad tests. Like, it does require that you have 75% code coverage, but with the code coverage, it means that you have to execute 75% lines. It doesn't mean that you have to execute them in a meaningful way. It just means that you have to execute them in some way. Which there's so many ways of call your code without writing anything meaningful. So you just call it, you execute, you have your 75%, and you don't test for anything. I've seen it so many times. It happens all the time.
System classes in Apex, a lot of them actually, but some more important than others. The string, math, and date class, definitely look into them if you are a beginner programmer. And then we have all of this
Definitely on the string one and on the date one. And probably also keep in mind that there are actually a lot of them, and kind of have a look, at least know what is there, because you don't need like we don't need you don't need to memorize all of them, but you do need to check them whenever you try to implement something, because you'd be surprised for how many use cases Salesforce actually have standard functions. In, I would say, in 80% of the cases, you don't need to implement anything with the strings. It's already implemented for you with the string class. Yep, that's why we never even considered introducing code coverage requirements. It would only depress both devs, the ones that want meaningful tests, and those who hate tests. Well, I think having the 75% requirement is actually a good thing. It kind of pushes you to testing it. Like, if you're a decent developer, it will hurt you to write bad test. That's the same in Dynamics now. The standard can do a lot, but many devs do not know it. That's true. That's true. Like, I think that 75% is good. It doesn't mean that you will have awesome tests, but it kind of, if you're a good developer, you will not write bad tests. You will write at least okayish test. So, and if someone is bad developer, then having 75% or not having 75% doesn't matter.
this stuff inside of advanced Apex. If you're just starting out, it's okay to kind of skip over this or maybe do some reading on it, especially like asynchronous and Apex callouts, but they are very important for making sure that your code is efficient and doing just some of those things that you need to do in development, like using APIs for callouts and design pattern, exception handling. Very important that you have a plan or some sort of exception handling when your code isn't doing what you expect it to do. When you're trying to learn some of these concepts, there are a few resources that I recommend. Of course, there's Trailhead, Salesforce's learning platform. There's Camp Apex and Apex.
Please no Trailhead. Please no Trailhead. Trailhead is not good for learning those things. I mean, it's good to read documentation, but it's not good in general for learning programming.
Sandbox.io where you can get hands-on, and then like I mentioned earlier, Cloud Code, which is a combination of the fundamentals of programming and Apex fundamentals. You're learning them all at the same time, and we even cover a lot of the advanced Apex topics. So let's move on to Lightning Web Components, and this is really where you're trying to make custom user interfaces. Think of this like traditional web development for Salesforce. So there's a front end component and a back end, and oftentimes Salesforce developers are basically full stack developers, right? You're working on the back end of Apex and then writing these Lightning Web Components, which are the front end pieces. So lots of things to learn in here, and there could be an entire branch that is just JavaScript fundamentals, because JavaScript is its own language. But since we know those,
And it's JavaScript, not even TypeScript. So we're stuck with the JavaScript, and we don't have a way out because we have to use JavaScript.
basics building blocks, it's not going to be as hard to pick up a language like JavaScript. There's a ton of Salesforce specific things though, like data binding and certain event handling that goes on with Salesforce development. So it's important that you start to dive a little bit deeper on how Lightning Web Components work. And of course, Trailhead is a great spot for that, but I love just getting hands-on. Since LWC is a modern web framework, of course, you can do things like styling with CSS, and there is an existing library that Salesforce provides called SLDS, which gives you kind of like a base to start off with to make sure that your code and your designs look very similar to Salesforce. And
SLDS SLDS is basically Tailwind. Well, with Walter is saying that LWC is modern framework. No, like having I was writing modern stuff now for the last already 3 weeks. LWC is not even nearly as modern as Next.js or not even React. But Igor, my mama said JavaScript is the best. Not hating on JavaScript.
And speaking of making things look like Salesforce, there is a component library, which is just pre-built elements that have existing functionality that you can use already. So it's very important for you to get into the component library, see what components already exist so that you're not reinventing the wheel on that one. This will be very helpful on your LWC journey and make sure that you speed up in your development. And of course, there's
now, Now, if you're new to LWC, it's actually super hard to learn those components because you need to understand how components communicate with each other, how event handling works, how all the SLDS stuff works. So yes, it's gonna help, but keep in mind that it's not easy, not like you can't learn it in a day. Let's say you need to practice a lot to understand them, how they work, and how to, more importantly, how to integrate them and when to use them and when to use something else.
There's the component aspect of it, right? You're stacking these different HTML elements inside of each other. So you need to make sure that they can communicate properly. And this is potentially an advanced topic. It's in here in custom events, but it's such an important or a foundational item that we have it even outside here. Then we jump into a lot of the advanced topics, and if you haven't written like one or two LWCs and at least have gotten started, don't really worry about some of the other pieces in here. But once you start dabbling in them even more and you like doing LWC development, look at some of these advanced topics, and a lot of them I go over in my LWC course, which is on salesforcementor.com, so check that out in the description. Now, there definitely is a lot in this Salesforce Developer roadmap, but this should give you a little more focus and not needing to worry about all of the other things that exist out here in development, right? If you focus on these items, you'll get really good at Salesforce development and probably be ready for a junior level job, right? All of these things you will see on job descriptions and people will ask you about in interviews. Of course, let me know in the comments what you think about this roadmap. Have I missed anything? Are there pieces that I should dive deeper on? I would love to hear it. Now we know what Salesforce development concepts to focus on, but that doesn't guarantee you a Salesforce job. You've got to do a lot of things like resume building
Yeah,
and
of
interviewing and get that door open. And one of the best tools to open the door into Salesforce development are all the different certifications. And if you don't know which ones to focus on, check out this video over here that goes over my top 3 Salesforce developer certifications.
All right, ads. Yeah, I think it's a really good roadmap. So I like it. I would like to adjust it a little bit. I mean, we can go a little bit more specific as well. But in general, this really good roadmap. I like it. It gives like it makes it looks like it's simple, but you can spend on each of those small topics. You can easily spend a month or something. So it's not like quick done. All right, that's it.